Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Origins of Today podcast. So, we've got another medieval themed episode for you. I sit down with Colton from Credenzio Studios and we talk about the Crusades, modern misconceptions of the Crusades, and everything in between. So, I really hope you guys enjoy this episode. Make sure to go check out Credenzio Studios. They're working on a game right now called Lionhearts Reforged, and it's set in the Crusades. It looks like it's going to be fire. Check out Credenzio's YouTube channel, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video and have a good day. We're going to get straight into it right after this intro.
And some, I assume, are good people.
I will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
You need to pray for the good Lord to protect America.
Won the race of discovery against the Germans.
All right, hello guys. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Colton from Credenzio Studios. How you been, man? What's up?
Good. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk.
Yeah. So today we're actually just going to be kind of having a bit of a discussion on the Crusades. You have a bit of experience in that, right? You kind of specialized in that.
Yeah. So I studied it in school and studied it as a pastime, as a hobby for many years. Wouldn't say I'm an expert or even a historian of that matter, but I definitely am passionate about the subject, and I've looked into it a lot. I'm a game developer is my profession. I'm developing a game and developed a game set in the Crusades, so we had to do a lot of research to make that come to life.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, kind of just starting off, obviously the main direction of my channel right now is comparing past events to present events. So I recently released a video where we talked about how there are these like modern misconceptions of the Crusades and Islam, medieval Islam. And I just wondering, because I know you've probably got a lot more experience on that than I do. What have you seen come out of like modern ideas of history in general? But if you really want to kind of narrow in on medieval history and the Crusades, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think the Crusades it's a very controversial topic, and I think religious war is rightly controversial for many reasons. It's important to note that the Crusades weren't a purely religious war, and neither was the jihadist conquests that the Muslims were doing for hundreds of years before. In many ways, the Crusades were a response to jihadist and Muslim aggression for hundreds of years, taking over Christian and Byzantine lands. Now, they weren't a response in the same way as the Reconquista was, because the Reconquista was mostly Spaniards retaking their own land. This was Christians who basically had no heritage or association other than their religion to the Holy Land, that traveled thousands of miles, or at least 1,000 miles, I'd say, from very different areas at the request of Pope Urban II, who called the First Crusade. And there were many reports. Propaganda is more of a modern word, but you could say propaganda. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, but there was propaganda used about Seljuk Turks torturing Christians in Turkey. Obviously, Christians were being enslaved, and Pope Urban II used that as a rallying call to call the First Crusade, in which case they marched and successfully took the city of Jerusalem after besieging Antioch and established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Subsequent crusades were met with varying success. I'd say the Second Crusade was pretty much a disaster. The Third Crusade was probably the most successful besides the First. And the Fourth Crusade was certainly an unmitigated disaster and total tragedy for the Christian forces, because Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders, and they didn't achieve anything for their cause. They actually harmed the cause substantially, maybe even undoing the progress of the previous crusades. The latter crusades, 5th through 9th, are not really my expertise. However, the Holy Roman Emperor at one point was able to reclaim Jerusalem diplomatically. There were several campaigns in Egypt that were met with varied success. Edward the Longshanks led a campaign with varied success. But the earlier crusades are usually what people think of. Later on, it became sort of a badge of honor to go on crusade, to take up the cross is what they would call it. And my favorite characters from the Crusades are Richard and Saladin, and our game is set in the Third Crusade for that reason. I just think they're fascinating characters.
Yeah, for sure. So when we talk about, something actually kind of caught my attention. I did do a little bit of research on the Fourth Crusade more recently. Could you kind of explain a little bit of the reasoning? Because it does seem so strange that the Fourth Crusade would just go and sack Constantinople, a fellow Christian city. Do historians know? Do we kind of know why that decision was made?
So the Fourth Crusaders ended up they wanted to go to the Holy Land, and they ended up incurring a ton of debt to the Venetians, which they were a powerhouse at that time, Venice. And the Doge of Venice leveraged their debt to attack his political adversaries. So the chief and most foremost adversary that the Venetians were dealing with were the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire. They also took some cities on the way, and one in modern day Croatia that they sacked, a Christian city. And eventually they did go to Constantinople and sacked it. They put a prostitute on the throne. They ransacked the Hagia Sophia and the city. And many of the remnants from their sacking is actually found in San Marco's Basilica in Venice today. I haven't been there. You can actually see the 4 chariots, horsemen, I think, the Golden Horseman that was taken directly from Constantinople at that time. Of course, now it's Istanbul. It's a Muslim city. It's very different. But we have these remnants in San Marco's Basilica, and inside San Marco's is this beautiful Byzantine golden mosaic and style, but it's all loot. It's all loot from the city. And the effects of as to why, it's definitely the debt, and that was leveraged against them. And after that, it just sort of died out, and that I believe the Latin kingdom was established in Constantinople, which was basically a Western Crusader kingdom that took over Constantinople. It was eventually retaken by the Byzantines, but it significantly weakened them in their efforts against the Seljuk Turks. If that attack had again been leveraged against Islamic forces in the Holy Land and didn't weaken the Byzantine Empire, we might be looking at a very different map today. However, that's just theory. Can't say for sure.
Yeah. So obviously Europe at this time, even though they were sending out kind of unified crusades, you could say they were not a unified nation. I mean, so the Europe at that time, it was mostly Christian. I know there was like a sizable Jewish population, and some pagan, but was there still a lot of infighting even during the times when they would come together for a crusade, kind of united by their common goal of...
Yeah, certainly there was a ton of infighting. The Crusades were unifying abroad, but I like to use the example of the Third Crusade because that's just where I know best. So we have Philip II and King Richard the Lionheart, and Richard was technically a vassal of Philip, but they were rivals. And Richard owned lands in modern day France, and they were vying for territory and power before, during, and after the Crusade. Philip actually returned from Crusade. He sort of betrayed his call to arms, his cause, and returned and became sort of a villain, if you will, in my opinion, at least. Yeah. While Richard was on crusade, decided to take his lands against his oath to do not that. And it really crippled the Third Crusade because Richard felt this immense pressure to go home and defend Normandy, or at least the Angevin lands he had taken in France and held. His brother John was sort of fledgling and not doing very well, holding down the island of England or the island of Britain itself, and people were very upset at him. That's where the Magna Carta came out, because people disliked John so much, and the story of Robin Hood was written at that time because John was doing such a poor job. So he had a ton of pressure and a bunch of issues back home while he was actually having a very successful campaign abroad. So Europe had a ton of contesting elements. I actually think I would argue the church was one of the only unifying elements that kept them from completely demolishing each other totally. And certainly the Crusades were an area where people just that called themselves Christians could come together and fight alongside each other, maybe put a rivalry aside, although it was very expensive. You had to sell tons of land and goods and stuff just to be able to afford passage to get to the Holy Land. It was very expensive and very difficult to travel that far at that time. So certainly there were tons of contentions. We talk about other religions. Certainly a stable Jewish population in Europe, as well as a pagan presence in Northern Europe, which some of the Northern Crusades were trying to deal with later in the sort of Scandinavian regions. The Teutonic Knights, post-Third Crusade, definitely had a role to play in that. As for the Jewish population, one of the more horrific things that the Crusaders did was they would often go on what we call a pogrom against Jewish people and massacre them on their way to the Holy Land. Sort of, why go all the way to the Middle East to kill infidels when we have infidels right here, which is one of the uglier parts of Crusades history for sure. And they would go to these Jewish villages and just massacre everybody there. One of the more horrific elements for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we even see that in some instances. We see it today, but we also saw that all the way up through, at least major pogroms, all the way up until really the 20th century, obviously culminating in the Third Reich. But so you mentioned actually earlier that you would need, it cost a lot to get and go on a crusade and actually get to the Holy Lands. What would, a knight that was going on a crusade, what would he actually require to go on the crusade? What would be what would he need besides what he already has?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. It's, in my understanding of it, it would either be somebody very wealthy or attached to somebody wealthy, or somebody very poor that had nothing to lose. Because we had things like the Children's Crusade with Peter the Hermit, with just a bunch of peasants basically marching to the Holy Land. Many of them died on the way. It was a treacherous journey through Anatolia specifically, very difficult to trudge through. I mean, just large open spaces. Sometimes it became very mountainous and arid, not a ton of resources, constantly dealing with raiders and people harassing you. Getting through the Byzantines' lands was always tumultuous. The Byzantines always looked at Crusaders not as simple as they didn't think of it as simply as you'd think, like, oh, these people are coming to help us. A lot of the times they were very wary of them because, Eastern and Western Christianity had already schismed and split, and there was already some cultural tensions, as well as when like a giant army comes marching through your lands, you're okay, well, this is a little strange. The first Crusaders were able to get through, but subsequent Crusades relied on, the port city of Messina in Sicily, and launching out of Italy to go via sea, because it was so much easier to do that, but that still had its own dangers. As for what you would need, well, it just really depends. I just know that it would just cost an enormous amount. And it was, one of the biggest misconceptions of the Crusades was, I think some people try to put a Marxist tinge on it, like it was just a power grab, or just to grab more just to acquire more wealth and land and position. But it really was a self-sacrificing act to be able to do it. You had to really believe what you were doing was, for for some greater good, even if maybe, they were led astray, because they had to give up so much and it was so risky and dangerous. Many of them would never return. Many of them would return with far less. And it was just not an easy journey. Now, there was also the promise of maybe gaining some new lands and titles in the Holy Land through the Kingdom of Jerusalem and stuff, but that wasn't exactly a guarantee.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this earlier, but there's a big idea nowadays that the Crusades were kind of selfish, and like you said, almost Marxist in a way, where they're just going to get their own gain and get loot and stuff like that. What do you think? Do you think that the average person on a crusade, do you think they were there to actually get rich, or were they there for a more spiritual, religious reason?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, looking at it with a Marxist lens the Marxist view of history is a clamor for power and wealth and class. And viewing the Crusades that way just doesn't make any sense, because there was no guarantee of wealth or power. It actually required a sacrifice of those things, leaving your lands vulnerable to be taken when you're gone, such as what Richard did. It certainly might have been considered an act of vanity. That might be a more cynical view. I don't necessarily view it that way. I think these people really believed that they were fulfilling and defending, Christianity. And in a way they were, because jihad and Muslim aggression had really encroached very far into Europe itself. And, had not the Reconquista and the Crusades been launched, it's hard to say what would have happened. I mean, the tide of Islam was very successful at conquering many, many lands. And, it's not unique to Islam. There are plenty of it's just kind of human history. However, Christianity was definitely at risk of faltering. And I think that motivation was probably the core. Also, Jerusalem's a very holy city to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But the idea of the Holy Sepulchre was a driving force for Crusaders. Being able to see the tomb of Christ, being able to be in the Holy Sepulchre, which is the church in Jerusalem where Christ's tomb is, that was often the source of pilgrimage. And even Salah ad-Din, when he signed a treaty with Richard, he let a bunch of Richard's men under peace travel to Jerusalem unharmed to visit the Holy Sepulchre to fulfill their mission, because a lot of them, their mission was to go to the Holy Sepulchre as a pilgrimage. So it's not all cut and dry. And Salah ad-Din's one of the more interesting figures, because he's very often romanticized and by the West even, and he's displayed as very chivalric and for good reason. And although he wasn't a perfect figure, and he had his issues, as did Richard. There's a very romantic ideal of these two clashing kings, separate religions, but coming to these terms and, actually having sort of like a frenemy. Like I think Richard liked Salah ad-Din better than Philip, or his brother. Like, he had a lot of respect for him, and Salah ad-Din had an immense amount of respect for Richard. And so it's funny because even though they were on polar opposite sides, they were able to find some sort of respect for each other, and even, sort of like a fraternal love and understanding of each other's position. I think Salah ad-Din said to Richard that in his letter to him, like his last letter to Richard, he said, "If I was to lose the Holy Land to anybody, I'd want it to be you." Which is kind of like it's a bromantic thing to say.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think there are almost two extremes where you can go so far as to condemn the Crusades as a brutal massacre, and then you can also go all the way to the other side and say that, the Muslims were like almost unhuman. Because
certainly.
Yeah. So, I mean, just kind of getting into like modern misconceptions. Another one I've kind of heard is this idea that Islam was kind of religion of peace. You'll see a lot of people, I know actually a couple people I've talked to, and they're like, well, I thought, the Muslims were just minding their own business in the Holy Land, and the Crusaders came along and just messed all that up. And I think if anyone studies history for, 10 minutes, they'll figure out that wasn't the case. But, I mean, what do you just kind of say to that kind of idea, and where do you think it came from, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think Islam can strive to be a religion of peace, and it can be read that way, and it can also be read the opposite way. There's this concept of lesser jihad and greater jihad. Greater jihad is a very admirable idea. It's the struggle against yourself. It's self-mastery. Lesser jihad is the struggle against non-Muslims, and it's sort of baked into many aspects of the religion that non-Muslims should be, persecuted. And I'm not an expert on the Quran. I'm not an expert on Islam. What I will say is that certainly the Crusades were a provoked response to Muslim aggression. Now, at this point, the lands had been held by by Muslims for many years. So it's not like, I think the Reconquista is a bit of a different story. I do think that, although it was also held by Muslims for hundreds of years by the time it was reconquered, it just was reconquered by people, the actual Christians from that land.
Yeah.
So the tricky thing is, it's not black or white. And St. Augustine, I believe, wrote his just war theory. And in it basically makes the claim that there's not really a just war. The many are not just. Mm-hmm. A just war would be like purely self-defense. So but even beyond that, so imagine if somebody came up to your family with a knife and was, ready to kill them all, right? You would be justified by St. Augustine's standard to kill him to stop that. Mm-hmm. But if he just came after you with a knife, the Christian thing to do would actually be to let him kill you, because it would be better to let him do that, turn the other cheek, than to commit the sin of murder yourself to stop him. It would be better to just trade your life for his. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very difficult thing to. I mean, I think even many Christians today would, they would have a hard time doing that. And I think you could argue that. I mean, the justification from the papacy certainly was this sort of just war idea. And I'm not totally unsympathetic, because I know that there were indeed atrocities and things being committed against Christians, taxes they would have to pay or they would be forced to convert in these Islamist lands. Now, it wasn't like it was easy to be. Depending
on the leaders, some of them did actually persecute and.
Yeah. But, no, for sure. I mean, a more liberal or tolerant policy would be allow them to pay the tax, and a more draconian one would be just kill them. So medieval times were very brutal and violent, and there's a reason there weren't many, if any, Muslims in Europe. They would have been facing so much of the same thing. That's why it's not black or white. However, to make the claim that it's one side or the other's fault is just silly. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's a war, and it's got a lot of complexities and interweaving motivations and reasons. Ultimately, whether we like it or not, as Christians, the outcome of battle is might makes right. Mm-hmm. And so the mightier side wins. And that's not a Christian ethic. So you can't balance the two and say the Crusades were a Christian act. They were a defense of Christianity, sure. And maybe without them, Christianity might not be around. That's a plausible outcome if, Muslim expansionism hadn't been stopped, because it was spreading like wildfire very successfully.
Yeah.
However, it was stopped, and Christians decided to go on crusade and stop them, and some of them committed terrible, terrible deeds. the tales of the First Crusade, the Crusaders were up to their knees in blood on the Holy Mount from all the innocents they had killed after taking Jerusalem. I don't think Christ would have condoned that personally.
Yeah.
And I don't think that sort of thing is acceptable. And certainly the atrocities committed by the other side, the Muslim side, were, also terrible. And the Crusaders were motivated by those actions. And so Muslims weren't just sitting minding their own business, having done nothing. That's not really what it was. This was a provoked response, and it was, I don't know if you would call it a proportionate response, but it became a regional sensation for centuries, and this cultural clash between these two competing forces pushing back against each other. And what I love about the Third Crusade and the relationship between Richard and Saladin is you see that cordiality and peace between these two sides is possible. They end up with a treaty. It's an uneasy treaty, but the relationship between Saladin and Richard having this great respect, these people should hate each other. Mm-hmm. And Saladin offering generously to let the Christians come and visit the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, these are the sort of things that I think were good, and I think definitely are. I think there's a lot of hope to be found. Like, despite what people think, there's a lot of hope to be found between interreligions, Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the area, that we can not only tolerate each other, but at least not come unto arms and allow each other access to this sacred holy land that's so special to all of the Abrahamic religions. And that's really what I hope would be, encouraged today is, these, no matter what, I think spilling blood on this land is a tragedy, and it's not black and white. Like I said, I mean, there's so many different rationales and reasons people will come up with to say it's justified or not, or it was a unprovoked attack or not. And, ultimately those don't really matter as much as we might think they do. At the end of the day, we have to come together and try to reconcile our differences, because I don't believe that, at least today, I don't believe that conflict is the answer. And if the Crusaders or the Islamists at the time did what they thought they had to do to protect their lands, what they viewed as rightfully their lands, and unfortunately led to a lot of death and war.
Yeah. And we're even seeing death and war in that area now. And
yes, where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see how it pans out. Yeah. And then kind of just taking a little bit of a different tack here. So obviously the Muslim empire ended up being extremely large by the time it kind of hit its peak. And you see them ruling over a bunch of different cultures. And you can kind of draw similarities between that and the Roman Empire. Obviously, once a nation gets large enough, it'll kind of start ruling over a bunch of different people groups. And that kind of was the undoing of the Roman Empire in a way. Whereas you see the Muslim Empire didn't really face many problems in regards to different cultures kind of becoming the undoing of the empire. Obviously, there was the different caliphates and stuff like that. But I do wonder how much of that had to do with kind of this, you were Muslim if you were in the Muslim Empire, right? And there was a lot of persecution towards other religions. And like we said, I mean, that happened in Christian Europe too, towards other religions. But I mean, why do you think the reason is that there was almost a unity in that?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways to look at this from a secular historical perspective and then a religious perspective. I I think a secular perspective, you could take a cynical look and say, a lot of people were just scared, so they just did what they said. Yeah. I think a religious perspective is there is a religious yearning inside the human heart to believe in something, and that has to be filled by something. It's either going to be filled by Christianity or Islam or modern politics or whatever. And so if you grew up in a Muslim area and you were taught that from a young age, that's just what you would believe that's just what you believe would be true. You could say the same from a Christian area. Now, it doesn't mean and neither being raised that way isn't an argument that it's right or not. You could be raised up into the right religion or the wrong religion, technically. But it wouldn't necessarily be the fault of yours that you were raised that way. The theological sort of tinge on that would be you're not fallible for that upraised belief unless you were presented with the truth and rejected it. That would be a Christian or maybe even a Catholic view, that if you were presented with the gospel or you presented with the truth of Christ and you rejected it, that would then be your fault. But if you never, if you never came to believe those things, or came to know those things, it wouldn't necessarily be your fault, even if you were still in error. But I have many very good Muslim friends and very good Christian friends, and they're people who try to do the right thing and try to follow their religion. And I don't know any person. I know they're out there, but I don't know many, violent extremists. I don't know any.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're out there, and it's a problem. And I don't necessarily lay it at the feet of the religion. I think people have accountability for their actions. I think it'd be kind of an excuse just to say, oh, they're violent because of this or that. It's, they're still accountable for their choices, and there are many Christians who are accountable for their violence as well. And trying to say, a Muslim probably would be just as uncomfortable with me saying it's Islam's fault as I would be somebody who said it was Christianity's fault for a Christian doing something. But I'm not going to equate the two religions. That's not what I believe. I'm a Christian for a reason, but at the same time, for the sake of diplomacy, I think people ought to be given the right to believe what they believe, and whether we like it or not as Christians, or whether Crusaders liked it or not, and no matter if these places became Muslim initially by conquest or not, now they're not. They're just Muslim, and they believe it, and they believe it fervently, and they have a right to believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I also think the medieval aspects of these religions, obviously, you can definitely see some. Well, you're Catholic, you can tell me, but do you think you practice your religion the same way Catholics in the medieval times did, or have certain things changed? Because I'd say maybe even the way people in medieval times looked at religion was different than the way we do now. Religion as an institution.
Yeah. I consider myself an Anglo-Catholic, not a Roman Catholic, just for reference, but I'm fine with the term Catholic is fine. Certainly not. No. I think anybody who tried to make that claim would be lying to themselves, because medieval people, the way that they lived life was so alien to us today. Mm-hmm. That it's hard to reconcile. We have so many luxuries and goods. Some of the poorest people in the United States live like kings for medieval times in some ways. That doesn't mean they don't have difficulties, certainly not. But the access that we have, even the idea that something like healthcare is a right, is a very novel, modern concept. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. I'm not making a political statement one way or another on that. But we have a totally different way of living today, and there are more obese people in the world today than there are people starving to death. Mm-hmm. So that's or malnourished. So we're dealing with a lot of different problems.
Yeah.
At the same time, that has to affect the way you practice your religion. And I think especially in America or with Protestantism, it's definitely way different than what early Christians would have been doing.
Yeah.
Or for good or ill. Like it's a lot different. It's the Christian culture in Europe was embedded the very roots of the society. I made a video about, kind of a couple videos discussing it, but it wasn't simply going to church on Sunday and greeting people with, oh, praise be to Christ. That's not what the Christian culture would have been. It would have been a totally transformative act to the whole society. And we have a separation of church and state here. They did not. They did not have a separation of that. They did not have a separate, it wasn't put into a box like it is today. I mean, it was your way of life. It wasn't just a set of practices or beliefs. It was a lot more transforming. Now, individuals still might have adhered to it or not, but people couldn't even read. So even the idea that the worship had to come through the church, that's a very offensive idea to Protestants, but it's, people weren't literate. You had to have a relationship with a priest and the church to understand the Gospels, to understand the Bible. It wasn't until the Gutenberg press that really revolutionized that, and literacy rates rose. I think it's a good thing that people have access to read it for themselves, obviously, now. Sure. At the same time, if you couldn't read and all you got this was audible, right, and storytelling and stuff, it would probably totally change your relationship to it. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think we can totally comprehend what they were experiencing with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it'd be like if, my pastor of my church had political power in my county. Like if he influenced, the leader or like my governor or something like that. You're right.
Yeah.
The separation of church and state, I mean, is very much intertwined. The Pope had to, if the Pope didn't say you were king, you weren't king or something like that, right? Like a lot of it was kind of.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Henry VIII situation, which we Anglicans get constant flack for, but that situation obviously was, King Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage, and the Pope said no, right? So there was it. He's the king, but he doesn't have his own autonomy. That's how interwoven it was. Mm-hmm. And the political favor between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope was so strong, and Henry was the emperor's rival. So it influenced a lot of different things. And kind of going back to the Crusades, people believed that the papacy was, speaking for God in some ways. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but yeah. So if that was the case and they were telling you this, you would take it seriously. And luckily for us, the papacy, I believe they made mistakes, and I don't believe they're a perfect institution. I don't believe the church is a perfect institution because it's human run. But luckily, most of the time they were pretty solid, and even things like the Crusades. I think the Inquisition's another matter I don't know enough about, but things like the Crusades, all things considered, somewhat reasonable because of, the threat that was, attacking Eastern Christendom, the Eastern Schism, and I think that the papacy probably felt an immense pressure to defend Christendom and try to use all their levers to do so. Regardless if, again, the act of war is not Christ-like. And, at the same time, Christ did come in and flip over all the tables in the temple.
Yeah.
Said, I did not come to bring peace on earth, but a sword. But I don't think if you read that, he's not referring to just, murdering everybody who doesn't believe the same thing that you believe. So if the Crusades were an act of killing infidels for the sake of that they're infidels, I think that it'd be very hard to justify them. If it was the act of defense, it's a little bit more feasible.
For sure.
However, we know that it wasn't that cut and dry. So,
yeah, there's definitely shades to it. Yeah, getting into just a little bit of a different topic. What's your opinion on kind of modern representations of the Crusades, like Kingdom of Heaven or video games based off of the Crusades? Are they accurate? Are they insulting? I mean, how do you feel about those?
Great question. I have like a love-hate relationship with Ridley Scott. He's an atheist director, and it shows sometimes. I actually think his representation in the director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven is actually very good. It's one of my favorite movies. It's still way too secular in a way.
Yeah.
But I think he does a pretty solid job. Now, it's obviously biased against the Crusaders in a lot of ways, but he does a good job making it not black and white. Like, there are good and bad Crusaders. There only really seem to be good Saracens. There don't really seem to be, wicked Saracens displayed in the film, or, Muslims. And Saladin's romanticized, of course. I think it's a pretty solid movie. I think it's a pretty solid adaptation. It's not super historical, but no movies really are. Like, it takes some wild, inaccurate steps, but the story is what's important to me usually, and the themes, and I think he does a pretty solid job. It's one of my favorite movies. And as for other media, there's the Crusaders always seem to be the bad guys. Typically, I know there's some shows that may be exceptions, like that Nightfall show, and although I haven't seen too much of it, I think they are a little bit less bent against Crusaders. Although the show is not really taking place in the Crusades as much as it is in Europe, if I recall correctly. And show like Assassin's Creed 1 is in the Third Crusade, and does an okay job, I think, at representing it. I think modern people are very cynical of the Crusades, and they don't really understand them, and they view them as worse than other wars, and they view them as, like you said, like this unprovoked attack of aggression by Christianity against innocent Muslims, and that obviously wasn't the case. Nor was it the case that they were completely justified and totally without error. So it's complicated. It's nuanced, and people don't really like that answer because they want people want you to say one really big, sweeping, condemning thing for one side or the other, but the truth often lies in between. And it's I think if you got to study this stuff. And when you study this stuff, you'll understand that it's immensely complicated.
Yeah.
and people devote their lives to studying it. I'm not one of those people. I just maybe have a fraction of a hair of the knowledge that, my professor did, that I took Crusades classes under, and people with PhDs on this stuff. And but I think a nuanced take is probably the best.
For sure.
And for that reason, I think Kingdom of Heaven does an okay job, because it's at least shows some nuance.
Yeah. All right. Well, kind of on the topic of video games, just to kind of wrap this up, do you want to talk about your game, Lionhearts, real quick?
Yeah. Thanks for the plug. So we're actually developing a game set in the Crusades called Lionhearts, and it takes place during the Third Crusade. It's a massive multiplayer online game. And one of the cool things about it is it's completely player driven. So you as the player get to rise up through the hierarchies in a feudal progression system. So you start at the bottom and you work your way up through your competence and merit. And each kingdom only has one monarch. So if you're the monarch of a kingdom, you're basically a celebrity, but you have to work your way up to that. You can become a duke and a lord and a knight. There's 3 tiers. There's a trade tier for, trading resources, gathering resources. There's a military tier for fighting, and then there's a religious tier. And actually, one of the cooler things we're developing is a prayer mechanic where you can learn real life prayers and blessings to cast sort of incantations. They give you kind of small buffs, but you get to learn the real prayers and memorize them and use them in your own life, which is one of the cooler things that we're developing that I'm really excited about. And the best thing you could do is go to our Kickstarter and follow it. We're going to be going live pretty soon, and you can donate as much as you want when it goes live. There'll be a lot of awesome perks, and we're also on Steam if you want a wish list.
Link will be in the description for all that stuff. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, Colton. And I hope you guys learned a lot. And if you guys want to back on, definitely make sure to like this video and subscribe. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your time, and thanks everybody for watching.
Of course. Hope you guys have a great day, and God bless.